Today's video is sponsored by World of Warships. If you've ever wanted to combine your love of history, warships, and let's not forget that need to unleash a massive naval volley into the broadside of your enemy, well, this is the game for you. World of Warships combines the thrill of action and strategic gameplay. You're going to need to not only outgun, but also outthink your opponent. Now, I've been playing this for over a year, and I especially love the idea of how focused the developers are on keeping the ships historically accurate. As you make your way up through the ranks, you'll actually be ascending through the times of the great gunships. And what's more, they're always upgrading the maps, releasing new naval units, and deploying the legendary ships from history. If you sign up now as a new player, you can use the invite code BattleStations2020 and you'll be started with a host of bonus items. And with over 30 million players worldwide, you'll always have someone to go toe-to-toe with. I left a link in the description of the video below, so give it a click and engage in your naval combat experience today. And now for the video you've been waiting for. History would remember this as the disaster of the Vega. With both regions and most of the Castilian army now dead, the Kingdom of Castile was effectively neutralized. The chroniclers of the time would speak of the defeat in terms of entire towns being depopulated, frontier cities losing their garrisons, and years before the Castilian army could be effectively restored. Ismail, who had proven to be a vigorous and effective leader, would go on to secure his position as the new Emir of Granada. He now definitively held the initiative, and just as it happened to turn out, in the next few years, he would also get his hands on a relatively new weapon. That's right, gunpowder. Ismail and the next two emirs, Muhammad IV and Yusuf I, would now turn the tables on Castile. One offensive after another, now backed up by cannon, was aggressively launched against their northern neighbor. The Guzat, again the elite cavalry, were unleashed with a vengeance. Granada proved her military might as it was finally her turn to recapture cities and fortresses along the border. The Merinids, who were well supplied with both money and manpower, would also take advantage of the situation. They landed in strength in 1329, destroyed a defending Castilian force, and took Algeciras. And then a mere 4 years later, the Merinids would team up with Granada and retake Gibraltar. But the Reconquista was by no means dead. By the time Gibraltar fell in 1333, the tide was inevitably turning. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Portugal, and Aragon still had significant manpower and resources. All the Christian kingdoms really needed was strong leadership and cohesiveness. As I mentioned before, Castile's king, Alphonso XI, was only a year old when his father died. He was only 8 when the Battle of the Vega claimed the lives of his regents and most of his army. Castile, in the aftermath of this disaster, was once again thrown back into a succession crisis. But finally, in 1325, Alphonso XI came to power. But make no mistake, his ascension was a very difficult time. He had to struggle to regain control over his throne and to secure his borders. But within his veins ran the blood of his warrior king forefathers. He was a descendant of Ferdinand III, after all. And thus, within a decade, he had put his aristocracy in line, subdued revolts, and rebuilt his army. What's more, with most of the ports of the Strait of Gibraltar in Muslim hands, Alphonso XI initiated a naval buildup. This buildup would not go unnoticed. The Merinids would do likewise, which resulted in a naval arms race. From the time of his ascension onwards, the new Castilian king made it clear that he had a very aggressive nature. Now granted, he would alternate between periods of war and peace with the emirate. But when he decided to take the offensive, he would blaze a path through Granada, inflicting major defeats along the way. And while he was doing this, he was still building up his navy. The long game for him was retaking the Strait of Gibraltar and isolating Granada from her North African allies. The way he figured was that if he was able to do that, he might just be able to complete the Reconquista. Now these exploits would not come cheap. Building a navy and maintaining an army is an expensive endeavor at the best of times. They would drain his economy, and by 1340, Castilian coffers were nearly empty. This year, by the way, 1340, would also be the year that everything would change. The naval arms race that was occurring had produced lethal navies for both the Marinids and the Castilians. A confrontation was inevitable. The North African Caliphate by this point had secured allies with the Muslims of Tunisia, and the two united their ships together, creating essentially an armada. Sensing this growing threat, Alphonso XI quickly brought in naval reinforcements from Aragon. In April of 1340, the two fleets met near Gibraltar. The Marinids and their allies, through deft maneuvering, got the upper hand and managed to surround the Castilian navy. By the end of that day, they had annihilated Alfonso's fleet. A full-flung invasion of Castile was now only a matter of time. The Marinid Caliph Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Othman, who, unlike Alfonso, had wealth in abundance, felt that it was his time to destroy his Christian rivals once and for all. With an uncontested sea, he raised a massive army and landed them in the Iberian Peninsula. This army was so massive that it took 2 weeks to bring in all of his troops. Of course, by this time, word of his naval victory had spread, and there is nothing like military success to encourage one's allies. The Emir of Granada, now Yusuf I, who, sensing an opportunity and not wanting to be left out on the spoils, decided to come in with his own army to reinforce the Marinids. Abu al-Hasan Ali, again the Marinid Caliph, was so confident that he led his troops personally, took with him piles of cash and luxuries, and even brought along most of his own family. I guess he wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You know, you take a military expedition and why not add on a family vacation? In late September 1340, the Muslim forces moved out of their marshalling areas and began to lay siege to Tarifa. This, by the way, was the last port in Christian hands that overlooked the Strait of Gibraltar. Meanwhile, Alfonso XI of Castile was in crisis mode. His navy was destroyed, he was completely outnumbered with a massive army on his doorstep, and there was almost no money left to raise more troops. He appealed to anyone that would listen for help. Luckily, the Pope declared his effort a crusade and released desperately needed funds. Thus, religious orders began to flock to his banner, and the King of Portugal, Alfonso IV, who happened to be his father-in-law, came to his aid. The Castilian king gathered his forces together near Seville, and from there he marched towards Tarifa, picking up allies along the way. On October 29th, he took up a position on a hill that overlooked the sea. It was approximately 5 miles north of Tarifa. That night, he deployed 1,000 of his knights and 4,000 of his infantry to loop around the Muslim besiegers and secretly enter Tarifa to reinforce the garrison. The maneuver went unnoticed, or at least unreported. The Caliph, Abu al-Hasan, ordered the siege at Tarifa to be lifted to deal with this new threat. With the two armies now facing off, it was clear that the Marinids had brought over a majority of their military power, and thus held the numerical superiority. The more credible sources had the combined Muslim force at about 65,000, whereas the Christian side was estimated to be only a mere 22,000. On the morning of October 30th, with his supplies running low, Alfonso XI decided to engage his enemy. Abu al-Hasan took up a position on a hill with the city of Tarifa to his rear. He deployed his son, Abu Umar, to his left flank, and Yusuf I of Granada took up a position on a nearby hill to secure the Marinid right. On the other side of the field, Alfonso placed his army for a broad frontal attack. He did this in order to use his heavy cavalry for what they were best known for, a massive charge. He then positioned his father-in-law, the King of Portugal, to secure his left flank. Now, if someone was to look at this from a purely analytical perspective, they would come to the conclusion that this was going to be a really difficult challenge. Not only was the Castilian king outnumbered with the sea to his back and running out of supplies, but the field itself was crossed by not just one but two shallow rivers, the Jara and the Salado. Now granted, in some areas they were not much more than streams, but they would still prove to be an obstacle. And even after these were crossed, the Castilians would have to charge uphill to engage the soldiers of the Caliph and the Emir. You can probably understand at this point why the Caliph and the Emir were feeling pretty secure. The battle commenced in mid-morning as Alfonso's men moved across the field. They crossed the Jara River without resistance, but crossing the Salado was going to be a much different story. The Marinids and the Granadans had advanced to the opposite bank, and despite the shallowness of the river, they were able to effectively block any crossing. Well, at least for a while. On the left flank, the Portuguese managed to finally ford the river and engage the Granadans directly in front of them. Meanwhile, on the right flank, the Castilians found a small bridge and, using heavy cavalry, managed to push back the Marinid defenders and cross the river. Seeing the Castilians crossing, Abu al-Hassan sent in his main force, and with a direct attack, they were able to stabilize the situation. But with his attention drawn to the battle ahead of him, the Caliph didn't notice what was happening behind him. Alfonso had ordered the garrison of Tarifa, again reinforced with his own knights and infantry, to exit the city and attack. This unseen force rode directly into the Muslim camp, destroyed the raw recruits that were left to defend it, and then charged down the hill into the rear of the Caliph's line. This was a completely untenable position, and in desperation, Abu al-Hassan ordered a last-ditch attack on Alfonso XI himself, who at this point had become isolated in the fight. The Castilian king drew his sword and was about to engage in hand-to-hand combat, only dissuaded at the last second by the Archbishop of Toledo, who literally had to drag the king back as his men fought on. Despite their numerical superiority, being attacked on nearly all sides was just too much for the Muslim position. The Caliph's men fought with intensity, but their formation disintegrated and collapsed. The Muslim army eventually had no other choice but to break and run. The Castilians and the Portuguese hunted down their fleeing enemy. This pursuit was nothing less than gruesome. Their combined cavalry rode down and slaughtered the men who were trying to escape, leaving in their wake a 5-mile-long path of carnage. Alfonso XI had grown up in the wake of the disaster at the Vega, but he had now revenged that battle and would be remembered by history with the title the Avenger. The Battle of Rio Salado, as it became known, was the place where the Marinid force was annihilated, which, as it would turn out, was a bulk of the Caliph's entire army. After 80 years of intervening in the Iberian Peninsula, the Marinids would never come back in force again. Indeed, the Caliphate would be devastated by the loss and would then enter into a period of rapid decline. The bottom line for Granada was that from this time onwards, North Africa was no longer going to be coming to the rescue, at least not in a major way. Now, going back to the battlefield for a second, in the Muslim camp, Alfonso XI also discovered the Caliph's massive treasury. The Castilian king, who at this point, for all intents and purposes, was, well, impoverished, would no longer be so. Now, to give you an idea of what kind of jackpot this was, the abundance he was able to secure was so great that it made gold markets throughout Western Europe plummet. The Castilian King, still quite in the prime of his life and now with cash in abundance, went to work expanding his army. And with the extra gold, he upgraded it with cannon. News of his victory attracted fighting men and crusaders from across Europe who flocked to his banner. Then, when he was ready, Alphonso XI launched one offensive after another against Granada. These attacks would really take their toll. Border cities would fall left and right. The armies of Granada that attempted to engage this incoming force would be destroyed, and fortresses that were once impregnable would no longer be so in the face of Castilian firepower. In the year 1344, Algeciras fell after a 2-year siege, her city walls having been battered down with artillery. This craft of using the big guns, by the way, would be something that Castile would only hone to perfection in the coming years. Granada continued to bring in Marinid mercenaries in a desperate attempt to turn the tide, but this was simply not enough. By the year 1350, with his opposition basically collapsing, Alfonso turned his attention to taking Gibraltar. His objective was to cut off North African reinforcements and secure the strait. Now, if he could accomplish that, he could move on to the bigger task of bringing down Granada once and for all. As the massive Castilian force came to lay siege to Gibraltar, it would seem that Granada's days were numbered. The emir could only look on as his opponent maneuvered into place and wondered how much time was left. On the night of March 25th in the year 1350, the siege of Gibraltar was well underway. Alfonso XI confidently reviewed his troops and was anticipating a good campaign ahead of him. And why not? He had a massive army, plenty of money in the bank account, his enemy was essentially on the ropes, and he had the will to fight. But strangely enough, despite being only 39 years old, that night he began to feel extremely weak and came down with a horrendous fever. Peculiar purplish-black spots began to appear on his body, expanding and growing, and only in a short period of time. What's more, many of the men in his army began to develop the exact same affliction. Alfonso XI was a true warrior king of Castile. He was the victor of Rio Salado, was responsible for kicking most of the Marinids out of the peninsula, and would be known to history as the Avenger. He was perhaps in one of the best positions to complete the Reconquista. But instead, the following morning he was found dead. And alongside him, much of his immense army had also died in the night. Because you see, the time of the Black Death had arrived.